car fixed yet? It's the Studebaker. Yeah, you know, the one with the little doggy in the window that goes...
For 11 seasons, Carol Burnett walked out onto a CBS soundstage every week and made the whole country laugh. She pulled her earlobe. She screamed like Tarzan. She fell down staircases in 50 pounds of curtain rod and drapery, and 30 million people tuned in to watch her do it. But somewhere in the middle of all that noise and applause sits one quiet half hour that she has spent decades trying not to think about. It aired once in 1977. Critics loved it. It won awards. And by Burnett's own account, she found it too painful to sit through again. To understand why a woman who built her entire career on turning pain into comedy would flinch at one of her own performances, you have to go back much further than 1977, all the way back to a one-room apartment above a Hollywood boarding house, where a little girl was already learning that laughter was the only thing standing between her and the dark. Carol Burnett was born on April 26, 1933, in San Antonio, Texas, to two parents who loved her but could not take care of her. Her father, Jody, worked at a movie theater and struggled with alcohol his entire adult life. Her mother, Louise, wanted to be a writer and drank just as hard. Neither parent had the stability to raise a child. And by the time Carol was old enough to understand what was happening around her, she already understood what it meant to come second to a bottle. Both of her parents would eventually die of illnesses tied to their drinking. It was Carol's grandmother, a formidable, tender woman named Mabel White, who actually raised her. In 1940, Mabel took 7-year-old Carol and moved the two of them to Hollywood, chasing the vague hope that things might be better there. They weren't glamorous by any stretch. Grandmother and granddaughter shared a single room in a rundown boarding house in a rough part of Hollywood, living on very little money, surrounded by neighbors who were themselves barely holding their lives together. But what Mabel gave Carol in that cramped room was something her parents never had the capacity to offer: steadiness. She was poor, but for the first time, she was safe. Money was so tight that on Saturdays, when Carol and her grandmother splurged on a 25-cent double feature at the local movie house, a real expense on their budget, the two of them would sometimes quietly take toilet paper from the theater restroom because they couldn't afford their own. It wasn't a scandal. It was survival. And Carol later spoke about it plainly, without shame, because there was nothing shameful about being a poor kid finding a way to get by. Those Saturday matinees became her escape hatch. For 2 hours at a time, the peeling wallpaper and the shouting neighbors disappeared, replaced by a world where everything sparkled and everyone eventually got what they wanted. It was in one of those darkened theaters that she first heard Johnny Weissmuller's Tarzan yell echo off the screen, and something in her latched onto it. She went home and practiced it obsessively, not realizing she was quietly training the same breath control and vocal range that professional singers spend years developing. What started as a kid messing around in a shared bedroom eventually became one of the most recognizable sound effects of her career, a party trick she'd bring out decades later in front of studio audiences who had no idea where it came from journalism major to the stage by the time Burnett graduated from Hollywood High School in 1951. Her plan was to study journalism. Her mother had once dreamed of being a writer herself. And in some quiet way, Carol felt like she was picking up something Louise had never gotten to finish. The only problem was tuition. UCLA was out of reach on the money she and her grandmother had, until an anonymous donor stepped in and covered her first year's fees. She never learned who it was. It was the first of two strangers who would alter the entire course of her life before she turned 22, and both times she had no way to thank them. At UCLA, an elective acting class knocked her journalism plan sideways. She discovered, almost by accident, that she could hold a room. She was funny. She could sing. She could make an audience laugh and then, a beat later, make them feel something else entirely. Her professors noticed. Her classmates noticed. By the end of her freshman year, she'd been named the most promising newcomer in the theater program, and for a girl who spent her whole childhood trying to make herself small enough not to be a burden, that recognition felt like permission to want something bigger for herself. The story that Burnett has told most often over the decades, the one that sounds almost too tidy to be true, happened during her junior year at a black tie fundraiser her professor had arranged as a class assignment Burnett performed a scene from Annie Get Your Gun, and afterward, while she was at the hors d'oeuvres table quietly slipping food into her purse to bring home to her mother and grandmother, a man tapped her on the shoulder. She braced herself, certain she'd been caught. Instead, he and his wife told her they loved her performance. That man, a San Diego businessman who never wanted his name known, offered Burnett and her boyfriend at the time, aspiring actor Don Soroyan, $1,000 each, an interest-free loan meant to get them to New York, where Carol had always dreamed of trying her hand at Broadway. He set 3 conditions. She could never reveal his identity. She had to use the money specifically to get to New York, and if she made it, she had to help someone else the same way he had helped her. He told her that someone had once done the same thing for him. Burnett kept every part of that promise. She and Soroyan packed up and left UCLA behind in 1954, and within 5 years, once her career had taken off, she paid the loan back in full, still never knowing and never revealing who the man was. New York nearly broke her before it made her. She and Soroyan checked into a hotel that ate through their money fast, and at one especially low point, Burnett called home in tears, ready to give up and go back to California. Then, sitting in her hotel room, she heard a radio announcer mention a hurricane moving up the coast. Hurricane Carol. She took it, half jokingly and half seriously, as a sign that she was meant to stay. She found her footing at the Rehearsal Club, a boarding house for young women trying to break into New York theater. For $18 a week, she got a cot in a room shared with several other aspiring actresses, one shared bathroom between all of them, and a level of chaos and camaraderie that felt to her like paradise compared to the isolation of her childhood. She worked nights as a hat-check girl and spent her days auditioning, scraping by the way everyone else in that house was scraping by. Her first real break came from an unlikely source, a satirical love song about the notoriously stiff Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, written by Ken Welch. It was a ridiculous premise for a song, and Burnett threw herself into it with total commitment, which is exactly what made it work. The bit got her booked on the Jack Parr Show, and then, in January 1957, onto the Ed Sullivan Show, where she walked out with shaking knees and left to genuine laughter. She kept building from there, a stint on the Paul Winchell Show, a short-lived sitcom called Stanley Opposite Buddy Hackett. Steady work, but not yet stardom. That changed in 1959, when Burnett landed the lead in Once Upon a Mattress, an off-Broadway musical that transferred to Broadway on the strength of its reviews and in large part on the strength of her performance as the loud, clumsy, thoroughly unglamorous Princess Winifred. It earned her a Tony nomination and made her, for the first time, a genuine New York name. When she eventually left the production, the show didn't survive long without her. Her replacement lasted only a handful of performances before it closed. Burnett had made herself, in the span of a few years, essentially irreplaceable. From 1959 to 1962, she became a regular on The Gary Moore Show, and it was there, doing loose, unscripted audience Q&As before each taping, that she first discovered how much she loved talking directly to a live crowd, a habit that would later become the signature opening of her own show. She won her first Emmy during that run. In 1962, she and Julie Andrews teamed up for a television special filmed at Carnegie Hall, a pairing CBS executives had initially been lukewarm about. The special, once it finally got made, won multiple awards, including an Emmy, and the soundtrack even charted on Billboard. It proved, if there was still any doubt, that Burnett could headline something entirely on her own terms. The Carol Burnett Show premiered on CBS on September 11, 1967, and ran for 11 seasons through March of 1978. At its peak, it pulled in around 30 million viewers a week, an enormous number for any show, let alone a sketch and variety program built around one woman who was, at the time, doing something almost no other woman on American television had been allowed to do, headline her own hour week after week with her name on the marquee. The show was groundbreaking in more than one sense. It was one of the first programs to build its comedy around live sketches performed in front of a real studio audience, without a laugh track papering over the gaps, an approach that later shows, including Saturday Night Live, would borrow directly. Over its run, the show won 25 Primetime Emmy Awards across writing, choreography, musical material, and Outstanding Variety Series, along with 3 consecutive People's Choice Awards and 2 Golden Globes for Burnett personally. Much of the show's chemistry came from its ensemble. Harvey Korman was there almost from the start and became one of Burnett's most important comic partners, for times winning an Emmy for his supporting work on the show. He was also, by most accounts including Burnett's own, prone to genuine frustration during the grind of a live weekly production. And there's a well-known story about a rocky patch during one season where tempers flared badly enough that his continued presence on the show was briefly in real doubt before the two of them worked it out and went right back to being creative partners. Tim Conway joined as a regular in the mid-1970s and became famous for a very specific kind of chaos. He refused to fully commit to a bit in rehearsal, saving his most unpredictable improvisation for the live tape, which meant his castmates genuinely never knew what he was going to do until the cameras were rolling. His rambling, improvised elephant story during one installment of the show's recurring family sketches is still remembered as one of the moments where the cast, including Burnett and Vicki Lawrence, visibly and helplessly broke character laughing on camera. Those unscripted collapses into real laughter became, in a strange way, part of the show's whole identity. Proof that even the professionals couldn't always keep it together, which made the audience feel like they were on something private and real. Which brings us back to 1977, and to the character at the center of the show's most emotionally serious moment. Eunice Higgins, one-third of the show's long-running family sketches, alongside the sharp-tongued Mama, played by Vicki Lawrence, and the beleaguered Ed, played by Harvey Korman. Eunice was a woman defined by disappointment. Someone who had convinced herself, over and over, that this next thing would finally be the thing that made people take her seriously, and who was, over and over, proven wrong. In the sketch that aired in February 1977, Eunice prepares to appear as a contestant on the real television program The Gong Show, convinced that singing her heart out will finally be her moment. Instead, the panel, which actually featured genuine Gong Show personalities in cameo, including host Chuck Barris, humiliates her on camera. Burnett played it almost entirely straight, without the broad physical comedy that usually softened Eunice's disappointments. The camera lingered on her face as the character absorbed the rejection in real time, and by most accounts from people who worked on the show, the set went quiet by the end of the take. It wasn't written as a joke with a punchline. It was written deliberately as a small, ordinary heartbreak. The episode was well received. Critics praised it as some of the sharpest, most honest work Burnett had ever done on the show. But Burnett has said in later interviews that she found the sketch too close to something real in her own life to revisit comfortably, that Eunice's particular flavor of hope and humiliation touched a nerve rooted in her own childhood, in years of watching people around her want more than they were ever going to get. She has said, looking back, that she was glad the show took the risk of doing something that honest, even while acknowledging it sat a little outside what she thought of as the core mission of her program, which was to give people an hour away from their troubles, not a mirror held up to them. That single sketch had a long afterlife. It helped inspire a 1982 television movie called Eunice, and later, the spin-off sitcom Mama's Family. Though Burnett herself largely stepped back from the character once the material moved into new hands, particularly after a later divorce from producer Joe Hamilton, who held the rights to the family characters going forward. It's hard to separate Burnett's willingness to play a character like Eunice so honestly from what was actually happening in her personal life at the time. Her first marriage to Don Soroyan had ended in divorce in 1962 after the two drifted apart under the weight of her rising career and a stalled one. He struggled with depression and alcoholism for years afterward. Her second marriage to television producer Joe Hamilton in 1963 gave her 3 daughters, Carrie, Jody, and Erin, and a genuine creative partnership, since Hamilton produced her show for years and won several Emmys of his own doing it. But that marriage, too, eventually came apart, ending in divorce in 1984, worn down by the demands of 2 intense careers and by a family crisis that had been building for years by that point. That crisis centered on her eldest daughter, Carrie. By her early teens, Carrie Hamilton was using cocaine and other drugs heavily, later saying she turned to them partly as a way to feel like a person in her own right rather than simply Carol Burnett's daughter. Rather than hide it, Burnett made the unusual decision in 1979 to speak publicly about her daughter's addiction, putting the subject on the cover of a national magazine at a time when almost no public figure discussed a child's drug problem openly. It was a genuinely uncommon thing to do, and it came at real personal cost. Carrie, by her own account, hated her mother for the interventions and the rehab placements that eventually got her sober just before her 18th birthday. Burnett has described the philosophy that got her through that period simply: you have to love someone enough to let them hate you for a while. It worked. Carrie got sober and stayed that way. The two of them grew close again, eventually working together as actress and mother, and later as co-writers on a play called Hollywood Arms, based on Burnett's own childhood with her grandmother. Then, in January 2002, Carrie died of pneumonia, a complication of lung cancer that spread to her brain. She was 38 years old and never got to see Hollywood Arms open on stage. Burnett has said she didn't want to get out of bed for a long stretch after Carrie's death, but pushed through finishing the play because she felt she owed it to her daughter and to the director they'd been working with. The play went on to open, first in Chicago and later on Broadway, without Carrie there to see it. Burnett also weathered a very public legal fight during the same era. In 1976, the National Enquirer published a false claim that she'd been drunk in public near Henry Kissinger, a story that struck an especially raw nerve given how openly she'd spoken about alcoholism in her own family. She sued for damages, and the case dragged on for years before it was ultimately resolved in her favor, a result that's often credited with pushing tabloid publications toward at least somewhat more caution afterward. In the late 1990s, Burnett met Brian Miller, a man more than 20 years her junior, while performing in Long Beach. They married in 2001. Just 2 months later, Carrie died, and by Burnett's own account, Miller helped carry her through the hardest stretch of her life, encouraging her to finish the play she and Carrie had started together.